it was a crisp autumn evening when Caleb boarded the late-night train. He had spent the day hiking through Pennsylvania's rolling hills, capturing photos of the vibrant fall foliage. Exhausted but content, he settled into a seat near the back of the car, eager to rest during the long ride home. The train was nearly empty, with only a few scattered passengers quietly reading or dozing off. The hum of the train's engine and the rhythmic clatter of the wheels on the tracks created a soothing backdrop as the journey began. The interior of the car was dated, its worn seats and flickering fluorescent lights hinting at decades of service. Caleb didn't mind. The train's vintage charm felt nostalgic. He gazed out the window, watching the countryside blur into darkness as the train picked up speed. His thoughts wandered to the photographs he had taken earlier, imagining how they would look once edited. As the train entered a stretch of dense forest, the atmosphere inside the car seemed to shift. The lights flickered more frequently, casting eerie shadows that danced along the walls. Caleb glanced around, noticing that the other passengers had vanished. He hadn't heard them leave at any of the previous stops, but now he was alone. Just as he began to feel uneasy, a man appeared at the far end of the car. He was dressed in an old-fashioned conductor's uniform, complete with a brass-buttoned jacket and a peaked cap. The uniform looked pristine, as if it had been freshly laundered. The conductor's face, however, was pale and gaunt, his expression unreadable. The man didn't seem to walk, but rather glided down the aisle, his polished shoes making no sound against the floor. Caleb's unease deepened as the conductor stopped directly in front of him. Without a word, the man extended a hand, offering Caleb a small, faded train ticket. The ticket's edges were frayed, and the ink was smudged, but Caleb could still make out the date. October 23rd, 1912. Confused, Caleb looked up to question the conductor, but the man merely smiled and gestured toward the window. Turning his head, Caleb's breath caught in his throat. The scenery outside had changed entirely. Instead of modern stations and illuminated towns, the train was now passing through an old, dilapidated station. The platform was overgrown with weeds, and rusted tracks branched off into the darkness. The station's name, barely legible on a crumbling sign, read Black Hollow. Caleb's heart pounded as he turned back to the conductor, only to find that he had disappeared. Panic set in as the train began to slow, its brakes screeching in protest. The car shuddered to a halt, and the doors slid open with a groan. Beyond the platform, shadows loomed, their shapes indistinct but unnervingly human. A whispering sound filled the air, growing louder with each passing moment. It seemed to come from all around, the voices overlapping in a chilling cacophony. Caleb clutched the ticket tightly, feeling an inexplicable compulsion to step off the train. But before his foot could touch the platform, a sudden jolt sent the train lurching forward. The doors slammed shut, and the shadows outside recoiled as if repelled by an unseen force. As the train sped away, the whispers faded, replaced by the steady clatter of wheels on the tracks. Caleb sank back into his seat, his hands trembling. The ticket in his hand had vanished, leaving only a faint residue of dust. When the train finally pulled into his stop, Caleb stumbled off, desperate for fresh air. He vowed never to take the late-night train again. The next day, he couldn't shake the memory of the conductor in the eerie station. Determined to find answers, Caleb delved into local history. His research led him to a chilling discovery. On October 23, 1912, a catastrophic derailment had occurred near Black Hollow Station. The train, overloaded with passengers, had plunged off a collapsing bridge, killing everyone on board. Among the victims was the conductor, whose body was never recovered. To this day, late-night travelers on that line occasionally report encounters with the phantom conductor. Some receive tickets, while others hear whispers in the darkness. For Caleb, the experience was a stark reminder that some journeys leave echoes, and that the past is never truly gone. I've never believed in ghosts or the paranormal. As a practical person, I've always relied on logic to explain the strange or unsettling. But one night during my college years, something happened that logic has never been able to untangle. It's been over a decade, and I can still hear those screams when I close my eyes. It was my second year of college when I got a part-time job as a cleaner for the local transit authority. The hours were terrible, but the pay was decent, and it worked around my class schedule. Most of the work involved sweeping platforms, wiping down benches, and cleaning graffiti. I didn't mind it, except for one station, Ravenswood End. Ravenswood End was an old, seldom-used stop on the outskirts of the city. The station had been built in the early 1900s, and it showed. Cracked tiles lined the walls, the lighting was dim and unreliable, and the tunnels seemed to swallow sound. It was the kind of place that made you feel like you were being watched, even when you were alone. One night, I was assigned to clean Ravenswood End after the last train had passed through. I arrived just after midnight, armed with my mop, bucket, and a flashlight. The air inside the station was damp and cold, carrying the faint scent of mildew. The silence was oppressive, broken only by the distant drip of water echoing through the tunnels. The station itself felt like a relic from another time. The benches were wooden, their varnish chipped and worn. The tiled walls bore the faint remnants of advertisements long since faded. Shadows lingered in the corners, shifting subtly with the flickering light. I set to work, trying to ignore the uneasy feeling that crept over me. The platform stretched out in both directions, vanishing into darkness at either end. My footsteps echoed, each one seeming louder than the last. I had just finished mopping the platform when I heard it, a faint scream coming from the direction of the tunnel. I froze, my flashlight trembling in my hand. It wasn't a sharp, panicked scream, but a low, drawn-out wail that sent chills racing down my spine. "Hello?" I called, my voice echoing off the walls. The sound didn't repeat, and I convinced myself it was just the wind or an animal. Taking a deep breath, I returned to my work, determined to finish quickly. A few minutes later, the scream came again, louder this time. It seemed to echo from deep within the tunnel. I shone my flashlight into the darkness, but the beam barely penetrated the void. Every instinct screamed at me to leave, but my curiosity overrode my fear. I told myself it was probably some kids messing around and decided to investigate. As I stepped closer to the tunnel, the air grew colder, and the smell of mildew intensified. The darkness seemed alive, pressing in on me as I walked. My flashlight flickered, and for a heart-stopping moment I was plunged into total darkness. When the beam returned, it illuminated a figure standing just inside the tunnel. The figure was barely visible, shrouded in shadow. It was humanoid, but its proportions seemed wrong. Its arms were too long, and its head tilted at an unnatural angle. Before I could react, it let out another scream, the sound raw and filled with anguish. I stumbled backward, dropping my flashlight. The scream faded, replaced by the sound of footsteps, fast, heavy footsteps racing toward me. I scrambled to pick up the flashlight and ran back to the platform, my heart pounding. When I reached the exit, I looked back but saw nothing. The tunnel was empty. Shaking, I reported what had happened to my supervisor. He dismissed it as exhaustion or an overactive imagination, but I knew what I had seen and heard. I refused to work at Ravenswood End again, even if it meant losing the job. Months later, I learned the station had a dark history. Decades earlier, a train had derailed just beyond the tunnel, killing dozens of passengers. Among the victims was a young woman who had been searching for her missing child. According to local legend, her spirit still roams the tunnels, screaming for her lost child. The incident at Ravenswood End stayed with me, nagging at the edges of my mind. I began digging deeper into the station's past, uncovering a history far darker than I'd imagined. The derailment was just the beginning. Over the decades, Ravenswood End had been the site of numerous accidents, disappearances, and unexplained phenomena. Local legends spoke of workers who vanished during the station's construction. Their bodies never recovered. Others claimed to have seen shadowy figures on the tracks or heard whispers in the tunnels. One particularly chilling account came from a retired transit worker who described seeing a pale, ghostly figure walking along the platform late at night, vanishing into thin air when approached. Years later, unable to shake the memory, I decided to return to Ravenswood End. Equipped with better lighting and a determination to face my fears, I ventured into the station late one night. The air was as cold and damp as I remembered, the silence just as oppressive. As I approached the tunnel, I felt the same creeping unease. My flashlight revealed nothing unusual at first, but as I stepped closer, I saw faint footprints in the dust. Footprints that led into the tunnel and stopped abruptly. I called out, my voice trembling, but the only response was the distant echo of my own words. Determined to find answers, I entered the tunnel. The darkness swallowed me, and the cold seemed to seep into my bones. As I moved deeper, the air grew heavy, and the faint scent of mildew was joined by something else, a metallic tang that made my stomach churn. The screams came again, louder and more desperate. I followed the sound, my flashlight flickering ominously. Just as I was about to turn back, I saw it. The same figure from before, standing motionless in the darkness. This time, it was closer, its distorted features illuminated by the unsteady beam of my flashlight. The figure raised its arms, and the screams turned into a deafening cacophony. I turned and ran, the sound chasing me all the way back to the platform. When I emerged into the open air, I collapsed, gasping for breath. To this day, I don't know what I encountered in that tunnel. Was it the spirit of the woman searching for her child, or something darker? I've tried to rationalize it, to convince myself it was just a trick of the mind or an echo from the past. But deep down, I know the truth. Some places carry the weight of their history, and some spirits never find peace. I'm not the kind of person who scares easily. Years of late-night commutes and odd encounters in the city have toughened me up. But one night, something happened that I'll never forget. It started as just another late shift, and by the end, I was questioning everything I thought I knew about the world. I had just finished a double shift at the restaurant where I worked and caught the last train out of downtown Chicago. It was a cold winter night, and snow had begun to fall, blanketing the streets in silence. The station was nearly empty, and the air smelled faintly of damp concrete and hot metal. I boarded the train, relieved to find a seat near the back of the car. There were only a few other passengers: a middle-aged man absorbed in his newspaper, a woman staring out the window, and a teenager with earbuds in, bobbing his head to music I couldn't hear. The train jerked forward, the lights flickered briefly, and we were off. I leaned back and closed my eyes, hoping to catch a quick nap before my stop. But something felt off. The air in the car grew colder, and the hum of the train's engine seemed muted, almost as if we were traveling underwater. When I opened my eyes, I noticed her. A woman had boarded at the last stop and was sitting across from me. She was dressed in an old-fashioned black dress that seemed out of place in modern times. Her pale skin and dark hair framed a face that was striking but unnervingly still. She didn't move, didn't blink, and her eyes, they were fixed on me. At first, I tried to ignore her, convincing myself that she was just another late-night commuter. But as the train sped through the city, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. Her gaze never wavered, and the air around her seemed unnaturally cold. I could see my breath misting in the air, even though the train's heater was on full blast. The train entered a long, dark tunnel, and the lights flickered again. When they came back on, the woman was sitting closer, just one seat away. My heart pounded in my chest as I glanced around, hoping someone else had noticed her, but the other passengers seemed oblivious. The man with the newspaper hadn't turned a page. The woman by the window stared blankly into the darkness, and the teenager's head still bobbed to his silent rhythm. "Can I help you?" I finally asked, my voice trembling. She tilted her head slightly as if considering my question but didn't respond. Instead, she reached out and placed a hand on my arm. Her touch was icy, and a jolt of fear shot through me. I pulled away, stumbling to my feet. The lights flickered again, and the train came to an abrupt halt. The jolt threw me off balance, and I grabbed a pole to steady myself. When I looked back, the woman was gone. The seat where she'd been sitting was empty, but the cold lingered, and my skin prickled with unease. The train doors opened, but we weren't at a station. Outside, there was nothing but darkness. No platforms, no signs, just an endless void. The other passengers didn't move. They sat frozen in place, their faces blank and lifeless. Panic set in as I realized I was the only one reacting. A low whisper filled the car, growing louder with each passing second. The words were unintelligible, but the tone was unmistakable. Pleading, desperate, and filled with sorrow. I backed away, my heart racing, until I was pressed against the door. The whispering stopped abruptly, replaced by a deafening silence. When the train lurched forward again, the lights flickered one last time. The other passengers came back to life as if nothing had happened. The man turned a page in his newspaper, the woman resumed staring out the window, and the teenager adjusted his earbuds. My seat was still empty, and the air had returned to its normal temperature. I stumbled off the train at the next stop, shaken but relieved to be back in the real world. As I stepped onto the platform, I turned to look at the train one last time. In the window of my car, I saw her. The woman in the black dress was standing where I had been sitting, her cold eyes watching me as the train pulled away. Over the next few days, I found myself obsessing over what had happened. I scoured the internet for any stories or rumors about ghosts on the Chicago train system. To my surprise, I found several accounts that bore eerie similarities to mine. Passengers described a pale woman in old-fashioned clothing who would appear late at night, always on the last train. Some claimed she would vanish as suddenly as she appeared, while others spoke of her whispering unintelligible words or touching them with hands like ice. A few even mentioned her cold, unblinking stare. One account in particular caught my attention. A man wrote about an incident from 20 years earlier when he was a security guard for the transit system. He'd been patrolling a station late at night when he saw a woman matching her description. She'd been standing on the platform, staring at the tracks. He called out to her, but she didn't respond. When he approached, she stepped off the edge and vanished before she hit the ground. The more I read, the more unsettled I became. These stories weren't isolated incidents. They spanned decades and came from different parts of the city. But who was she? Why was she haunting the trains? And what did she want from me? My curiosity soon got the better of me. Against my better judgment, I decided to take the last train again. This time, I came prepared. I brought a camera, a voice recorder, and a small notebook to document anything unusual. I also told a friend about my plan in case something went wrong. When the night came, I boarded the train with a mix of fear and anticipation. The car was nearly empty, just like before. I sat near the back, clutching my equipment tightly. As the train moved through the city, I kept my eyes peeled for any sign of her. For the first few stops, nothing happened. I began to wonder if I'd imagined the whole thing. But as we entered the same dark tunnel, the air grew cold, and the lights flickered. My heart raced as I saw her again. She was sitting across from me, just as she had before. This time, I didn't wait. I raised my camera and snapped a photo. The flash illuminated the car for a split second, and when the light faded, she was gone. My breath came in short gasps as I checked the camera's screen. The photo showed an empty seat, but the air around it was distorted, as if the light had bent unnaturally. I turned on the voice recorder and began to ask questions. "Who are you? What do you want?" My voice echoed in the empty car. For a moment, there was nothing but silence. Then, a faint whisper came through the recorder, not aloud, but directly through the device. The words were still unintelligible, but they sent chills down my spine. Suddenly, the train came to another abrupt halt. The lights went out completely, plunging me into darkness. Panic set in as I fumbled for my flashlight. When I turned it on, the beam revealed her standing just a few feet away. Her face was inches from mine, her cold breath visible in the light. Her eyes, they were filled with sorrow and something else, something I couldn't identify. Before I could react, she raised a hand and touched my chest. A wave of cold washed over me, and for a moment I felt an overwhelming sense of grief. It was as if I were drowning in her pain. Then she stepped back and disappeared into the darkness. When the lights came back on, I found myself alone. The train began moving again, and I sat in stunned silence until I reached my stop. I didn't look back as I left the platform, too afraid of what I might see. In the days that followed, I reviewed the recordings and photos I'd taken. The whispers on the recorder were clearer now, though I still couldn't understand them. The photos showed more distortions, and in one, I could make out a faint outline of her face. But the most chilling discovery came from the notebook. At some point during the encounter, I'd written a single phrase over and over, though I had no memory of doing it. "Find me." I've never been able to make sense of that night. I've stopped taking the train altogether, opting for buses or ride-shares instead. But sometimes, when I'm alone at night, I feel a cold presence nearby, and I